back from the break. Now we'll move on to our next presentations. Our next presentation by Drs. Michelle Lamoli and Gopa Raychaudhuri will highlight various key international and regional initiatives that promote regulatory cooperation, convergence, and harmonization. Dr. Michelle Lamoli is with the International Programs Office in FDA's Center for Biologics and Research, or CBER. She is responsible for coordinating and collaborating on activities and strategic programs with various international organizations and governments, as well as within CBER. Dr. Gopa Raychaudhuri is the Associate Director for Special Programs in the Office of the Director in CBER. She is CBER's liaison to the WHO, where she oversees areas of strategic interest and CBER's scientific collaborations with the WHO. And now, please join me in welcoming Michelle Lamoli and Gopa Raychaudhuri.
Hello and welcome. I'm very pleased to be here today to provide you some perspectives on global regulatory cooperation, convergence, and harmonization, and to review opportunities for international engagement. As you can see from our presentation overview, FDA's engagement in global activities and our current approach will be reviewed. We will also look at several key international harmonization and regulatory convergence initiatives, their scope, goals, and activities, and we'll learn what opportunities are available to regulators and industry across the globe. In considering FDA's international activities, we work collaboratively internally within our centers, across our centers, within FDA, within our department, HHS, and other government offices. And we also have some international bilateral engagements, but for the most part, we have found that multilateral engagements are most effective. They spare resources, reduce duplication of efforts, promote global public health, encourage diversity with the international regulatory collaboration efforts across both developed and developing regulatory authorities. And they promote implementation of internationally developed guidelines and standards to reduce the burden of regulation. And we will give you some specific examples here of several initiatives, starting with one key forum in which we engage, and that is the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. In all of my examples, I will be providing you a web link for more information on the activity, what materials may be available to you as a resource, and how to join. The ICH draws on the expertise of regulators and industry to achieve international harmonization of technical guidelines to enhance public health. It was launched in 1990 with the US, EU, and Japan, and Canada, Switzerland, and WHO as official observers. And it's important to note that ICH has expanded its global participation and engagement through recent reforms. It has well-defined objectives to improve efficiency of the new drug development and registration processes, and to promote public health, prevent duplication of clinical trials in humans, and minimize the use of animal testing without compromising safety and effectiveness. And how we do this? It's accomplished through development of harmonized technical guidelines and standards that are implemented by the regulatory authority. And in this slide, you can see the four major topical areas for ICH, which are safety, efficacy, quality, and multidisciplinary topics. And all of our guidelines are in one of these areas. Multidisciplinary means it may be cross-cutting across safety, efficacy, or quality, or it may be involving an electronic standard. And in this slide, you can see our ICH members, and here are ICH observers. I also wanted to note for you that ICH is very committed to training, especially for regulators and for those who may wish to apply for membership for ICH. ICH is working to ensure that high-quality training is available based upon are scientific and regulatory principles outlined in its guidelines. And these efforts include developing a training library on the ICH website with access to all training materials, including working group presentations. And importantly, there's funding support for training programs organized by ICH that's available for regulatory members and observers. We have ICH recognized training programs that are hosted by a variety of organizations, associations, regulatory authorities, and academia, and they're offered in person, virtually, and online, and information is available on the ICH website. We're also working with academic contractors to develop online training materials and including some translations of guidelines and training materials. The next forum is the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program. And the IPRP is a safe harbor forum for global regulators to exchange information on issues of mutual interest. The IPRP was established by consolidating the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Forum, IPRF, and the International Generic Drug Regulators Program, the IGDRP, in 2013. Therefore, there are quite a few topics and work in the area of generic pharmaceutical products. It meets biannually on the borders of the ICH meeting and has interim telecons. And recent topics that have been discussed at the management committee level include regulatory reliance, e-labeling for pharmaceuticals, issues with ICH guideline implementation, and environmental risk assessments. In this next slide, you can see the IPRP membership. And IPRP has several work groups, including bioequivalence for generics, biosimilars, cell therapy, gene therapy, identification of medical products, nanomedicines, pharmacovigilance, and quality. And FDA leads the working groups for the cell therapy, gene therapy, biosimilars, and identification of medicinal products. And we would be glad to provide more information on joining these activities if you may be interested. The next forum is the ICMRA, ICMRA, International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. The ICMRA is a heads of agency leadership initiative, and at FDA, this is delegated to the center director level for both the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics. They address current and emerging pharmaceutical regulatory and safety challenges and work globally and strategically. There's been more of a recent focus on COVID-19, supporting strategic coordination and international cooperation among global medicine regulatory authorities. In the next slide, you can see the ICMRA members as well as ICMRA associate members. And to highlight some of their current activities and initiatives, they engage in the communications work group, there's a crisis management work group, pharmacovigilance, including big data, adverse event reporting, vaccines, there's a supply chain integrity initiative, antimicrobial resistance, and reliance. And the next initiative is the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee under the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. The APEC consists of 21 member economies, and here are the 21 countries. The Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee facilitates regulatory cooperation among medical product regulatory authorities to build human capacity in regulatory science. They also promote political goodwill for convergence among regulatory policymakers in the APEC and beyond. The scope of activities include pharmaceutical products, innovative products, and generic products, as well as medical devices. And the members of this organization are regulators from the APEC economies, industry coalitions in the research-based industry, generic industry, biotechnology products and advanced therapies, as well as medical devices, and a coalition of training partners. The RHSC has focused work streams in these 7 priority work areas: multi-regional clinical trials and good clinical practices inspections, pharmacovigilance, biotherapeutics, advanced therapies, good registration management, which is a combination of good submission practices by the industry and good review practices by the regulators, medical devices, and global supply chain integrity. And the countries in parentheses, besides each of these priority work areas, is the lead regulator for this initiative. And the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee promotes regulatory convergence through training. And we have over 20 APEX Centers of Excellence across the region. And here are some of our current Centers of Excellence and the topics upon which they provide training. And training can be for both regulators and industry and other interested parties. And now let's turn to the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, PICS or PIC-S. PICS is a non-binding, informal cooperative arrangement between regulatory authorities in GMPs of human and veterinary medical products. It's open to any authority having a comparable GMP inspection system, and PICS currently has 54 participating authorities globally. Their goal is to harmonize inspection procedures worldwide by developing common GMP standards and by providing training opportunities to inspectors. It facilitates cooperation and networking between and among competent authorities, regional and international organizations. In this slide, you can see the PICS participating authority. And PICS activities includes expert circles organized by topical area for APIs, good distribution practices, bloods, tissues, cells, ATMPs, quality risk management, control of cross-contamination, good clinical practices, computerized systems, veterinary products, as well as the PICS Inspectorates Academy. And the PICS Inspectorates Academy is a web-based educational center under the PICS umbrella, which aims at harmonizing and standardizing GMP training at the international level. And our last forum for today is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF. The IMDRF was launched in 2012 as a successor to the Global Harmonization Task Force. It has a chair and secretariat that rotates on an annual basis. It started with Australia in 2012, and this year, 2022, Australia is the host once again. Decisions are made by consensus, not voting. They have 2 in-person meetings per year in March and September, and interim telecons. But most importantly, for those who are not members and for industry or interested parties, these biannual meetings include public stakeholder sessions, which provide updates from the management committee members, the IMDRF working groups, regional harmonization initiatives, industry associations, and so on. And in this slide, you can see the members of the IMDRF. The IMDRF mission is to strategically accelerate international medical device regulatory convergence, to promote an efficient and effective regulatory model, and is responsive to emerging challenges in the sector while protecting and maximizing public health and safety. Their goals are to accelerate international medical device regulatory harmonization and convergence, address common public health regulatory challenges, accelerate innovation, and they have a focus on pre-market and post-market requirements. These are the current IMDRF working groups. There's good regulatory review practices, regulated product submissions, cybersecurity, personalized medical devices, AI, adverse event terminology, IVDs, and software as a medical device. And so, in summary, international regulatory cooperation has become an essential part of dealing effectively with the challenges of an increasingly complex and global environment. Engaging in regulatory convergence and harmonization efforts can improve efficiencies of the medical product development process, bringing much-needed generic and innovative products to patients more quickly. Working multilaterally has many benefits, including the sparing of resources, avoiding duplication of efforts, and reaching more stakeholders in efforts to improve global public health. There are many opportunities to engage in collaborative efforts globally, and I hope that with this presentation today, you will have a better understanding of the landscape and how you can become involved or become more involved in a range of activities, whether you are a regulator with the industry or an interested stakeholder. This concludes my part of the program, and I will be back for the Q&A session. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the opportunity to share an overview of CBER's collaborations with the World Health Organization and discuss how these engagements advance U.S. and global public health. I will give an overview of CBER's strategic priorities and principles that are the foundation of our global engagements. Then, I will briefly discuss CBER's role as a WHO collaborating center and our contribution to the WHO Vaccine Prequalification Program. And finally, I will touch briefly on CBER's support for strengthening regulatory systems working in partnership with the WHO. The World Health Assembly is the highest WHO decision-making body where member states provide strategic direction to the WHO on the areas of work that the WHO should prioritize. In 2014, the U.S., and specifically the FDA, led the effort to have the World Health Assembly pass a resolution that highlights the need to put more emphasis on regulatory system strengthening globally and promoting collaboration among regulators. This is a slide that the CDC developed when the global community was responding to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014 and 2015, and it is relevant today as we respond to multiple public health emergencies, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the monkeypox outbreaks in many countries in the world. The slide emphasizes that infectious diseases have no borders, and that a pathogen can travel from one side of the world to another in as little as 36 hours. So it is important to have open channels of communication and work collaboratively with our international partners to ensure readiness to respond to such emergencies efficiently and effectively when they happen. The WHO is an important strategic partner in a global environment that is increasingly interdependent. Protecting against infectious disease threats is a U.S. strategic priority, and regulatory authorities play an essential role in this effort. Cooperation among regulators is important for addressing challenges efficiently, and CBER's preferred approach is multilateral engagement with our regulatory counterparts to optimize the efficiency and impact of the collaboration. Our work with the WHO can be facilitated through WHO headquarters, WHO regional offices, and regional networks. These multilateral collaborations allow regulators to share knowledge and experience and promote best practices and regulatory convergence. Multilateral engagement increases efficiency, avoids duplication of effort, and optimizes the use of resources. I will talk a little bit now about CBER's role as a WHO collaborating center. The WHO relies on scientific and technical expertise and resources of collaborating centers to implement their mandated work. Partnership between WHO and CBER as a collaborating center enhances the public health mission of both organizations. CDER is a WHO collaborating center for biological standardization. CDER has had long-standing collaborations with the WHO for decades, but formalized the commitment to support the WHO as a collaborating center in 1998. Our work with the WHO is wide-ranging and focused on product areas that are regulated by CDER. That includes vaccines, blood and blood products, in vitro diagnostics for HIV, and cellular tissues and gene therapies. In broad terms, CDER experts contribute to development and implementation of WHO international standards, including physical standards such as reference materials and reagents used to standardize assays, and written standards such as WHO guideline documents. We support a wide range of activities for regulatory system strengthening and promoting best practices, and for research to advance standardization of biologicals. And we have experts participating as members of several WHO Global Advisory Committees. Our collaborating center activities also include participating in WHO consultations with other stakeholders to share information to advance product development. We support WHO's vaccine pre-qualification program, which I will discuss next. And CDER is one of 4 essential regulatory laboratories, or ERLs, in WHO's Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. As an ERL, we have an essential role in strain selection and generation of virus stocks and reagents needed for manufacture and release of influenza vaccines each year. And we are engaged in activities that are focused on strengthening preparedness to address threats of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. In these 2 slides, I've attempted to capture at a high level our extensive collaborations with the WHO through multilateral engagement with our regulatory counterparts from around the world. Now I would like to discuss FDA's role in supporting WHO's vaccine pre-qualification program. Over 60% of the babies in the world are immunized with WHO pre-qualified vaccines, so this is a very important program for global public health. Vaccine pre-qualification is integral to WHO's mission to make high-quality, safe, effective, and affordable vaccines available worldwide. Pre-qualification is a service that the WHO provides to UN agencies such as UNICEF and the PAHO Revolving Fund to purchase vaccines for global and regional immunization programs. Another important function of the WHO pre-qualification program is that it can be leveraged by countries to streamline registration of the vaccine in their own jurisdiction. The WHO relies on oversight by a functional national regulatory authority to ensure the quality, safety, and effectiveness of WHO pre-qualified vaccines throughout the product life cycle. FDA serves as a regulatory authority of reference for several WHO pre-qualified vaccines. As the reference NMRA, we make the commitment to inform WHO of anything that may impact the quality, safety, or effectiveness of the vaccine or impact vaccine supply. We are able to do this because we have a confidentiality agreement with the WHO that gives us legal authority to share relevant information to support WHO's vaccine pre-qualification program. For the last few minutes, I will discuss CDER's support for regulatory system strengthening, working in partnership with the WHO. The global reality is that the vast majority of countries in the world do not have a well-functioning, integrated regulatory system. 3/4 of the countries in the world do not have a fully functional regulatory authority, and more than half the countries in the world are at maturity level 1, meaning they have no formal approach to providing regulatory oversight of medical products. This highlights the need for regulatory system strengthening and why we have prioritized this area of work in our collaborations with the WHO. The Global Benchmarking Tool is an integral component of WHO's Regulatory System Strengthening Program. One thing that the Global Benchmarking Tool has that did not exist in previous WHO assessment tools is the designation of maturity level of a regulatory authority based on outcome of the benchmarking exercise. What's important to note is the designation as maturity level 3 and 4 indicates that the country has a stable, well-functioning, and integrated regulatory system. Countries with a regulatory system at maturity level 1 or 2 require further strengthening to be considered a fully functional regulatory authority. As I noted in the previous slide, almost 3/4 of the countries in the world do not have a well-functioning regulatory system, according to the WHO benchmarking criteria. However, with increased recognition of the importance of regulatory authorities and increased investment by countries in regulatory system strengthening, more countries are reaching maturity level 3, which is a very positive trend for public health. I have included this slide to give an overview of the regulatory functions that are evaluated by the Global Benchmarking Tool. I do not have time to discuss this comprehensive tool in detail today. However, I've provided a link at the bottom for further information and access to the tool itself for anyone who may be interested in learning about this tool for benchmarking regulatory systems. This slide shows the 5-tier process used by the WHO for benchmarking regulatory authorities and providing support for regulatory system strengthening. I've included a reference at the bottom if you would like further information on the WHO Regulatory System Strengthening Program and the systematic process they use for capacity building. There is increased focus on building manufacturing capacity for vaccines in all regions of the world to meet the global demand. This has been reinforced by the COVID-19 pandemic, where inequity in access was highlighted for countries in some regions of the world. A well-functioning, competent national regulatory authority is essential to ensure quality, safety, and efficacy of vaccines manufactured in the country. Therefore, as countries invest in building vaccine manufacturing capacity, it is critically important to concurrently invest in strengthening national regulatory capacity. The Global Benchmarking Tool is the primary means used by the WHO to assess regulatory systems, establish institutional development plans to address gaps, and further strengthen national regulatory authorities. More recently, the WHO has developed a framework for designating and publicly recognizing a regulatory authority as a WHO-listed authority. This framework was developed in response to member states' requests to have a transparent and evidence-based pathway for globally recognizing regulatory authorities that are operating at an advanced level of performance. The WLA framework replaces the concept of stringent regulatory authorities, which has been used for many years, and which was a designation originally given to the founding members of ICH. One major objective of the WLA framework is to promote reliance, whereby a country can leverage the work of trusted partners, such as WHO-listed authorities, for their own regulatory decision-making. The ultimate goal is to increase access to safe, effective, and quality medical products, especially in low and middle-income countries. CBER provides funding support to the WHO through a cooperative agreement to support a wide range of activities, many of which are focused on regulatory system strengthening. I don't have time to discuss this collaboration in detail, but I do want to say this was established because we view regulatory system strengthening to be extremely important. But we don't have the human resources to do these activities ourselves. So we provide funding support to the WHO so they can undertake regulatory system strengthening activities based on global and regional priorities. In summary, Our collaborations with the WHO advance CBER's strategic goal to improve national and global public health. We have a wide range of engagements with the WHO to advance product development, engage in dialogue with regulatory counterparts on emerging issues, strengthen regulatory systems, and maintain communication channels that can be used to rapidly address public health emergencies. These collaborations have been mutually beneficial and productive in advancing our common public health goals. On this slide, I've listed a few resources if you wish to get more detailed information on some of the WHO programs and areas of collaboration that I discussed briefly today. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss CBER's strategic goals to advance national and global public health and the multilateral approach that we take through our work with the WHO to advance these objectives. Thank you.
All right, thank you again to Drs. Michelle Lamouly and Dr. Gopal Chowdhury for those great presentations. They will be joining us just a bit later at the question and answer panel. Before the panel, we just have two more presentations. The first will be an overview of the review and approval process for a new drug application, or NDA, by Ms. Margaret Kober. Ms. Kober is Chief Project Management Staff in the Office of Regulatory Operations within the Office of New Drugs within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. And then our next final presentation for the day will be an overview of the review and approval process for an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, by Dr. John Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim is the Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs for the Office of Regulatory Operations in the Office of Generic Drugs. So please join me in welcoming Mrs. Kober.
Good morning. My name is Margie Kober. I'm with the Office of Regulatory Operations in the Office of New Drugs in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Today I'll be talking about the new drug approval process. This talk is designed to be a broad overview of the process, intended primarily for folks who may be new to FDA, and aimed at providing just some nuts and bolts that might be helpful as you navigate the process with us. Here are the topics we'll be talking about: pre-NDA activities, application types, application requirements and content, application review milestones, and communication practices. The pre-NDA activities are quite important. The work that you do before the NDA is assembled can be critical to the success of that NDA. You'll probably want to start with a pre-IND meeting. This is a discussion with the specific therapeutic area division. There's a link there to determine who that might be. And I will say that it is fine if you send it into the wrong division. We will transfer it internally. You don't have to send everything in twice. During that meeting, you'll want to discuss data requirements for the IND application, the data needed to support the rationale for testing in humans, design of model studies in animals, non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology, and drug activity studies, a bit about the initial drug development plans, and the regulatory requirements for safety and efficacy demonstration. It's important to remember that well-designed and well-conducted foreign clinical trials need not be conducted under an IND if certain conditions are met. Those conditions are outlined in 21 CFR 312.120 and 21 CFR 314.106. Examples include that FDA can inspect the clinical site and validate the data. Data are applicable to the U.S. population and U.S. medical practice. This is particularly important when there may be differences that you have to justify between the populations. And most important, that investigators are recognized as competent. Meetings are available throughout the various stages of research. These include the end of phase 2 meeting, where you'll talk to us about your phase 3 trial design, and then the pre-NDA meeting, where you'll discuss the top-line results and data from your phase 3 studies, and we'll also discuss the content and format of what the NDA should look like when it gets here. Also important to know is that user fees must be paid before an application is submitted. There are small business waivers available, so you'll want to discuss that early on. Switching topics a bit, it's good to determine what type of NDA it will be. Primarily, the distinction is between a 505(b)(1) and a 505(b)(2). These letters and numbers refer to language in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In a B1, you own or have the right of reference to all the data. In a B2, you're relying in part on literature or the agency's finding of safety and or effectiveness for one or more listed drugs. There are also different types of NDAs in terms of review clock, priority versus standard. A standard review for a non-new molecular entity is on a 10-month clock. For a new molecular entity, basically something we've never approved before, under the program that refers to the PDUFA terminology, is a 12-month clock. A priority review for a non-NME is a 6-month clock, and for an NME, it's an 8-month clock. So clearly, you would like to have a priority review. How do you get one of those? There's some criteria. First, the product has to treat a serious condition and, if approved, would provide a significant improvement in safety or effectiveness over available therapy. Or, if your application proposes a labeling change pursuant to a report on a pediatric study, it's important to know that not all pediatric studies qualify. If your product has been designated as a qualified infectious disease product, also known as a QIDP, it would also receive a priority review. And lastly, if you have a priority review voucher that you've either earned on your own or they are transferable so you can buy one, and these are given for rare pediatric diseases, tropical diseases, and medical countermeasures, also known as material threat countermeasures. There are different approval types as well. A full approval means that you can market the product and it's approved for use according to the agreed upon labeling. In a tentative approval, there may be unresolved patent or exclusivity issues and the product cannot be marketed under a tentative approval. Those have to be resolved to get a full approval. In a Subpart H situation, also known as accelerated approval, this is based on a surrogate endpoint that's reasonably expected to result in a clinically meaningful difference. But the approval also requires a confirmatory post-approval trial to validate that. Application requirements. The first thing you need to be sure to do is to submit the appropriate application type. Don't submit an NDA when you should submit a BLA. The difference is an NDA is for basically a small molecule. A BLA is for a biologic, and they are governed by different set of regulations. An NDA is also not appropriate if your product could be submitted as an ANDA, an abbreviated new drug application. Those are generally used for what we call generic drugs, and they are regulated under 505J. Outside the scope of this talk, but it's an important distinction to make. The application must also contain all required content, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in future slides. It should be in the ECTD format, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. ECTD stands for Electronic Common Technical Document, and important to know that the firm must not be in arrears for user fees before they submit the application. And arrears includes affiliates and subsidiaries. So when we talk about all relevant content items and information, those are defined in the regulations and several guidance documents. The regulations are found at 21 CFR 314. They include that you must submit reports of all investigations of the drug product sponsored by you and any other pertinent information. This means don't just send the studies that didn't fail, send them all. Information may be incorporated by reference if you have a letter of authorization, and if any of the information is in a foreign language, you must submit English translations. Module 1 contains regional administrative information. This includes the application form, the debarment statement, patent information and patent certification, claimed exclusivity, and labeling. The application form is known as the 356H, must be signed either electronically or with a wet signature. The debarment statement lets us know that you did not and will not use debarred investigators in any of your trials. Importantly, it must be worded exactly as you see in the regulation. Patent information differs from patent certification. Patent information refers to your product that's under review in this NDA. Patent certification is necessary for a 505(b)(2) application, basically telling us what you perceive to be whether or not you are infringing on another firm's patent. Claimed exclusivity is your mechanism to tell us what you believe to be the exclusivity you're entitled to if this were to be improved. For example, you would get 5 years normally for a new molecular entity, 3 years for a new indication, 7 years for an orphan drug, 5 years for a qualified infectious disease product, and if you have existing exclusivity, you can amend that with an additional 6 months added on if you do a specific type of pediatric study. Other modules in the ECTD include the summary overview in Module 2. Summary and overview are different concepts, although they sound like they would be the same. A summary is the data, and overview is the conclusions one would reasonably draw from a review of that data. So you have the quality, what's known as chemistry or chemistry manufacturing and controls data summarized. The clinical overview, summary of the conclusions. Clinical summary, top line data, non-clinical overview, and non-clinical summary. And then within the rest of the modules, Module 3 is devoted to quality or chemistry. Module 4 is non-clinical. Module 5 is clinical. That includes clinical pharmacology and statistics. The medical portion includes the integrated summary of safety and the integrated summary of effectiveness. Clinical microbiology pertains to those products that work in the microbiology realm. So think antibiotics, antivirals, those would have clinical microbiology sections. So when the NDA is ready to be sent in, what are the review milestones? First is, of course, submission. Once we receive the NDA, we assemble a review team, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. That review team will determine whether or not the application is reasonably complete for review purposes. There may be an advisory committee meeting, and at the end of the review cycle, we will take an action. That action will either be an approval, or it could be what we call a complete response, meaning that we will outline what we believe the deficiencies to be, and in most cases also give you an idea of what you can do to resolve those deficiencies before you resubmit your application. When we talk about assembling a review team, this is comprised of clinical, usually a primary reviewer, and either a team leader or a supervisor. There'll be division director involvement and sometimes office director involvement if it's a new molecular entity. Regulatory includes your regulatory health project manager and the chief, who is that person's supervisor. There's also a tertiary level in regulatory if it's needed. Non-clinical pharmacology and toxicology includes a primary reviewer and either a team leader or a supervisor. Sometimes there's also tertiary involvement there. Chemistry, quality has a number of different people working on things like the drug product or the drug substance. Botanical folks are also called in, and we'll talk about their role in just a minute. And then, of course, team leaders and supervisors there to pull it all together. And the environmental assessment is also part of chemistry, and if there are any biopharmaceutics kinds of questions, this is where they would also reside. Clinical pharmacology has the primary reviewer and team leader. Sometimes there's also tertiary review there as well. Biostatistics works closely with clinical, and there's 2 levels of review there as well. Then, as needed, we have a variety of consultants we can call on for their expertise. If this is a combination product that includes a device, there are folks from the Center for Radiologic Health and Devices that can help us. Botanical folks help out if there are specific questions about the quality of the botanical. The chemistry is very complicated in a botanical situation. If the studies raise ethical concerns, there are ethics experts that we can rely on. The Controlled Substances Act staff gets involved if this is something that may be scheduled by the DEA. And then we have patient labeling staff who help us out with comprehension of patient package insert, medication guide, patient labeling of any kind, instructions for use, etc. And then we have pediatric experts if there are pediatric studies. They also can help us with the use of the drug in lactation and pregnancy. So the decision to file is made within 60 days. If we refuse to file it, we'll communicate that decision and the reasons why, and that finding may be disputed. Or you can file over protest, which means that we will review it exactly as it was sent in with no amendments and no meetings. So you'll send it in, we'll review it, you'll get an answer, but there won't be any communication along the way. And a little bit about why that might be not a good situation. During this entire process, there's opportunities for meetings with FDA. And when I say meetings, that could also mean that we will respond in writing to your questions or have a teleconference or a video conference. At this point, we're still not doing face-to-face in-person meetings. We hope to get back to that soon, but it's not happening presently. For program applications, there's an opportunity to have both a mid-cycle and a late-cycle meeting with us. This is an opportunity for us to let you know where we're at in the process, any roadblocks we've hit, and any additional information we may need. And we'll also have labeling discussions, assuming that there aren't deficiencies that preclude them. If there are, we'll certainly let you know. There's actually a letter we send saying that there's no point in talking about labeling because we've got bigger problems. I would encourage you to get secure email as early as possible. This is handy for things that we need a quick turnaround on. It does not take the place of formal submissions, but it can be helpful for logistics in terms of scheduling a meeting. Not requesting a meeting, but once one's been granted, we want to make sure that we arrive at a mutually convenient time and date. The regulatory project manager that we talked about earlier is your single point of contact. I can't stress this enough. It is never appropriate for you to reach out directly to individual reviewers, division management, office management. Your regulatory project manager is the single point of contact, and I repeated it because it's so important. You'll want to discuss your communication preferences early on. Some people prefer phone, some people prefer email. That's something you can work out with your project manager, but it is important to know that what's the best way to reach me. It's helpful if you're going on vacation, you reach out and say, hey, I'll be off, but so-and-so is taking over, and, reach out to them. Hopefully that person also has secure email. And we'll do the same on our end. If there are issues that are identified during the filing process, we will communicate those issues in a 74-day letter. So that's just another form of communication with you. And then we do ask that if we send you an information request, that you respond as promptly as possible. These are usually sent in an effort to get to an answer. So you want that answer to be in your favor. Finally, we'll talk a bit about advisory committee meetings. The purpose of these meetings is to provide advice on technical and medical issues related to safety, effectiveness, testing. In some cases, that means if there's a need for a companion diagnostic, we'd like to discuss that. Sometimes it's a fairly new phenomenon. Labeling can be tricky. Sometimes we need help with that. And then generally the use of new drugs if they raise unique and novel issues. So not every drug goes to an advisory committee meeting. They're most often considered for new drugs expected to have a major therapeutic impact or major new uses of marketed drugs. We think of these as the repurposed drugs that might be used in ways that nobody predicted. If there are major safety concerns, sometimes it's good to have a public meeting like an advisory committee meeting to air those concerns. Sometimes we'll talk about the difference between a clinically meaningful difference in the drug versus placebo or a statistically meaningful difference. They are not the same. So sometimes you can have a statistical difference and it's not clinically meaningful. And lastly, we will consider surrogate markers and secondary endpoints depending on what those endpoints are. Very often, a company will have a variety of secondary endpoints and they think they should all wind up in labeling, and the agency will sometimes disagree with that. So an advisory committee can help us work that out. It's important to remember that advisory committee votes are non-binding on FDA. While we most often will abide by advisory committee advice, we do not always do so. And so that does not mean it's not a valuable process. It is. Always helps us with our look at the risk-benefit analysis and whether or not we're doing the best we can for the public health in either approving or not approving a drug. So that is the end of my presentation. I look forward to your questions in the question and answer sessions. I will say that it will not be possible for me to address specific situations. That conversation is best had with the review division and therapeutic area that you will be dealing with, but happy to answer general questions. Again, this was designed for folks who are relatively new to this whole concept, so please don't be shy. Happy to answer what I can, recognizing that I won't have all the answers, but I hope to be helpful, so I look forward to talking to you then.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Ibrahim. I'm the Associate Director for Regulatory Affairs for the Office of Regulatory Operations within the Office of Generic Drugs. In this presentation, I'll be providing a high-level overview of the approval process for an abbreviated new drug application, or an ANDA. ANDAs are applications that are submitted to gain approval for a generic drug. A generic drug is defined as a drug product that matches the reference listed drug, or RLD, with respect to the active ingredient, dosage form, route of administration, strengths, conditions of use, and labeling. Additionally, an ANDA application must demonstrate bioequivalence to the RLD. We'll take a closer look at these individual points, but first let's look at the overall process and life cycle of an ANDA. In general, the ANDA approval process and life cycle consists of submission of an ANDA, review, communication, response, and actions. This starts with the initial submission of the application by the applicant. At that point, FDA will review the submission and communicate the results of that review to the applicant. If deficiencies are noted from the reviews, those deficiencies will be provided. Once the applicant responds to those deficiencies, FDA will review those responses and communicate any additional deficiencies to the applicant. Once all deficiencies have been adequately addressed, FDA will either approve or tentatively approve the ANDA based on whether there are any patents or exclusivities that block final approval. After final approval of an ANDA, any changes made to the application would be submitted as a supplement to the ANDA. This is a closer look at the ANDA life cycle and how FDA communicates with the applicant that we just spoke about. Once the applicant submits the initial ANDA, the Division of Filing Review will review that the application is substantially complete and notify the applicant when the ANDA is acceptable for filing. Once an ANDA is found to be acceptable for filing, the individual disciplines will review their associated parts of the application, including pharmaceutical quality, previously known as CMC, bioequivalence, and labeling. The individual disciplines will then strive to provide deficiencies through information requests and discipline review letters, known as IRs and DRLs. Once the responses to an IR or a DRL is received, the discipline will review the deficiency responses. If necessary, the disciplines will repeat this process until the FDA takes an action on the ANDA. One action FDA might take is to send a complete response letter, or a CRL. CRLs are cumulative deficiency letters that include all outstanding deficiencies from all of the disciplines that are reviewing the applications. CRLs carry longer response due dates and are sent when necessary based on review timelines and the level of deficiencies. After a CRL is sent, an applicant can request a post-CRL meeting to ask any clarifying questions about the deficiencies in the CRL. Once the response to the CRL is received, the outstanding discipline will review the associated parts of the CRL response. FDA will continue this process of sending IR, DRLs, and or CRLs until all deficiencies have been resolved. Once all disciplines deem their reviews adequate, FDA will take an approval action on the ANDA. Final approval will be taken if there are no blocking patents or exclusivities. Tentative approval will be taken if there are patents or exclusivities that are blocking final approval. The review timelines for ANDAs are based on the Generic Drug User Fee Amendments Commitment Letter, or the GDUFA Commitment Letter, that is negotiated between industry and the FDA and enacted into law by Congress and the President. These timelines are expedited for ANDAs that fall into a prioritization category. The specific categories can be found in the Manual for Policy and Procedures 5240.3. Some common examples of these prioritization factors are first generics, where there might not be any approved ANDAs for a specific RLD, drug shortages, ANDAs that fall into the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, that are intended to provide global availability of antiretrovirals used for HIV, and public health emergencies such as the opioid crisis and COVID-19. During the review process, disciplines will review different parts of the application. An ANDA includes very similar pieces within the application as a new drug application or an NDA, with the exception of clinical trials. Rather than having to conduct clinical trials, ANDA applicants conduct bioequivalence studies to demonstrate that the ANDA is bioequivalent to the RLD. We'll take a closer look at this later in the presentation. The labeling for an ANDA application must have the same labeling as the RLD with some exceptions. There are permitted exceptions where the ANDA label may differ from the RLD's label, such as inactive ingredients and packaging configuration. Additionally, there may be patent or exclusivity protections on certain portions of the RLD's label. If permitted by the FDA, the ANDA label may omit these protected portions of the label, provided that the omission does not render the generic product less safe or effective than the RLD. The Orange Book provides use codes under the RLD that describe the general scope of the claims that are protected. These omissions are only permitted in instances where there are protected claims, so portions of the label that are not protected must be included in the label. Additionally, once the patent or exclusivity expires, those omitted portions must be added back into the ANDA label. Labeling reviewers will assess the contents of all labeling to ensure that the labels align with regulatory and statutory requirements. As I stated previously, an ANDA application must demonstrate that it is bioequivalent to the RLD. Specifically, the applicant must demonstrate that the rate and extent of absorption of the ANDA drug product does not show a significant difference from the rate and extent of absorption of the RLD drug product. There are different ways to demonstrate bioequivalence for different dosage forms and routes of administration. However, for most products, bioequivalence is demonstrated in studies that focus on the release of the drug substance, or the active pharmaceutical ingredient, from the overall drug product into the systemic circulation. Bioequivalence studies show the comparison of the systemic exposure profile of the ANDA drug product, or the test product, to the RLD drug product. This is a general depiction of an ANDA that is bioequivalent and an ANDA that is not bioequivalent. On the left, you can see the alignment of the systemic exposure between the test drug product and the RLD drug product. This ANDA drug product would be bioequivalent to the RLD. On the right, you can see the variance in systemic exposure between the test drug product and the RLD drug product. This ANDA drug product would not be bioequivalent to the RLD. Bioequivalence reviewers will review these studies to determine whether the ANDA drug product has demonstrated bioequivalence to the RLD drug product. As I stated previously, deficiencies may be sent to the ANDA applicant through a complete response letter, or a CRL. CRLs are a comprehensive list of outstanding deficiencies sent from the FDA. Deficiencies sent in CRLs can be major or minor in nature. A non-exhaustive list of major deficiencies can be found in the Guidance for Industry and the submission's amendments to abbreviated new drug applications under GDUFA. When the applicant submits a response to the CRL, the submission must contain a complete response to all deficiencies noted in the CRL. Partial responses to portions of the deficiencies or to only specific disciplines are not accepted. An applicant must respond to the CRL deficiencies or request an extension to respond within 1 year from the date the CRL was signed. Once all deficiencies have been resolved, an ANDA is eligible for approval. The type of approval the ANDA will receive is based on whether there are any patents or exclusivities under the RLD that block final approval. For the purposes of ANDA approvals, patents are property rights granted by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office that protect a drug manufacturer's innovation and can include, for example, their overall drug product or the indications of use for that drug. These patents can prevent other manufacturers from marketing similar drug products that are covered by such patents. Exclusivities are granted by the FDA. They offer protections that limit competition for a prescribed period of time for specific reasons, such as the patent challenge or 180-day exclusivity, which is granted to first generics when they're approved, or the orphan drug exclusivity, which is granted to applications that address a rare disease or condition. ANDA applicants have multiple avenues to navigate patents and exclusivities. It is common for an ANDA applicant to challenge patents held by the RLD. ANDA applicants may have to litigate these challenges in court. If litigation is initiated timely, the FDA cannot provide final approval to the ANDA for 30 months if litigation is ongoing. If, for example, litigation is dismissed based on a settlement agreement or the 30 months has lapsed and litigation is still ongoing, FDA can provide final approval to the application at that time as long as it continues to meet all of the requirements for approval. However, if there are still outstanding patents or exclusivities that block approval, FDA will tentatively approve the application as long as it continues to meet all of the requirements for approval. In the case where an ANDA is tentatively approved, the applicant will need to request final approval of the ANDA when they believe that the ANDA is no longer blocked by a patent or exclusivity. For final approval, all requirements for approval must be met. This includes that all discipline reviews are deemed adequate with no outstanding deficiencies, all facilities utilized in the application are deemed adequate at the time of approval, and that there are no patents, exclusivities, or other legal barriers to approval, such as court injunctions. After an ANDA is fully approved, any changes made to the application will generally be submitted as a supplement. There are two types of supplements for an ANDA: changes being effected supplements and prior approval supplements. In general, the difference between these types of supplements are based on the level of change that is occurring. The level of change affects the timing that an applicant is allowed to make that change to the ANDA drug product. Changes being effected supplements are moderate in nature, so the ANDA applicant can make the change prior to the approval of the supplement, but not before the allotted timeline. For a CBE 0 supplement, there is no allotted timeline, so the applicant can make the change as soon as the FDA receives the supplement. For a CBE 30 supplement, the timeline is 30 days, so the ANDA applicant cannot make the change until 30 days after the FDA receives the supplement. Prior approval supplements are major changes in nature, so the ANDA applicant cannot make the change until FDA has approved the supplement. One example of a change that would be made in a supplement is the addition of a new strength to the ANDA. If, for example, the applicant only submitted 1 out of 2 strengths in the original ANDA submission, and they later decide that they want to include the second strength after final approval of the ANDA, they would submit a supplement to add that second strength. Other examples are adding new or alternative manufacturing facilities, or updating the labeling of the ANDA label because there has been an update to the RLD label. In addition to supplements, however, applicants can submit changes to their ANDAs in their annual reports to the FDA. Changes sent in annual reports should be minor in nature and have a minimal potential to have an adverse effect on the overall drug product. That wraps up my overview of the approval process of an ANDA. Here are some helpful guidances and maps that provide more detail on what was discussed. Thank you for your time and attention, and have a great day.
Thank you again for those great presentations. We will now begin the question and answer panel. If you haven't had a chance to answer your question into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. We'll start with some questions that had come in from the audience for Margaret. This first question is, what application is used for a biological product in a specialized medical device, and how will these products be evaluated?
Great question, and there is not a short answer to that. There is a mechanism to request a jurisdictional determination.
Sorry, Margaret, it sounds like we may have lost some of your audio there. While we try to get that fixed, we might move on to questions for our next panelist. Let's go ahead and move on to some questions for Michelle. One question that came in for you is, I am with a less resource regulatory authority. Would we be able to join these initiatives? Is there a membership fee?
Oh, thank you, Nora, and thank you very much for the question. Yes, some fora do have a membership fee, like the ICH, and or an application fee, like the PICS, the Pharmaceutical Inspectorate Convention, which does have a very extensive application process. Some associations or initiatives have no fees involved at all, but the requirements vary according to the organization. And so I would therefore refer you to the respective website for the organization that you might be interested in as a regulatory authority. For any pharmaceutical regulators that are in the audience and interested and are starting out in the harmonization initiatives and regulatory convergence, I might suggest starting with the IPRP, the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program. And you could participate in management committee leadership discussions, as well as any working groups of interest. We do have 6 or 7 working groups that I did mention, and there is no cost or fees associated with that or any application fees. And so I thank you for that question, and back to you, Nora.
Thank you so much for that response. We'll go ahead and continue with some other questions that we have for you, Michelle. Next question is, how can industry get involved in harmonization?
Oh, very good question. Thank you. I would recommend that any of our industry participants today visit the respective websites of interest that you might be wanting to join or participate in activities. Some allow industry members and or observers in their forum. Some have stakeholder sessions in which you could participate. And some have some really good training, other resources and information on their website. And so I would highly recommend referring to the websites that you can find cited in my slide presentation. So thank you for that question.
Thank you again for that information. We have one more question for you, Michelle. For regional initiatives like APEC, are non-APEC countries' participation welcomed?
Very good question, and thank you for that. Yes. So, for example, the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative, which is, as you may recall from the slides, the 21 member economies or countries, they do welcome participants from outside the region, and we have been stressing that in the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee, in fact. The RHSC, Harmonization Steering Committee, has these centers of excellence training programs, and they will, in most cases, welcome those outside the region, especially regulators, if there is space available for training in their programs. So yes, please do explore initiatives outside of your region. And thank you for that, Nora. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Now we actually have some questions coming in for Gopa. first question for you. You said manufacturing capacity should be linked to building regulatory capacity. Can you explain this?
No, thanks very much for that for that question. So governments and countries are investing in building local manufacturing capacity, and that's a really positive development because there is a tremendous need for more manufacturing of vaccines and other medical products to meet the global need. And we certainly saw that in the context of the trying to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is especially true not only for COVID-19, but in our ability to be able to respond to public health emergencies efficiently in the future. So strengthening the regulatory authority in the country that is investing in building manufacturing capacity is important because the manufactured product will need to have adequate oversight to assure quality, safety, and efficacy to support licensure or marketing authorization. And the regulatory authority can also provide guidance to the manufacturer through the product development process, as is the case in many countries today. So it's really important to have a strong regulatory authority in the country where the manufacturing is being done. Another important point, at least related to vaccines, is that if a country has a regulatory authority that's functioning at maturity level 3 or 4, that allows the WHO to rely on that national regulatory authority for pre-qualification of vaccines, and we heard that from our WHO colleagues earlier in the day. And so that can broaden the access to vaccines in all regions of the world. So investing in regulatory capacity building along with investments in increasing manufacturing capacity is really quite important to assure that the medical products are safe, effective. It builds confidence in those products, and it can also help to increase global access. So those two efforts, building manufacturing capacity and strengthening regulatory capacity, really do need to go hand in hand. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that response. We'll do one more question that came in for you, Gopa. How does the FDA support the WHO pre-qualification program?
Yes, so that is such a critical program for global public health. For the case of vaccines, the WHO relies on regulatory oversight by a functional national regulatory authority for the vaccine. And as I mentioned, this is a requirement that's unique to vaccines. I don't think it's a requirement for drugs and diagnostics, but it is a requirement for vaccines. So as I noted in the presentation, if we, FDA, serve as the NRA of reference for WHO pre-qualified vaccines, we have an obligation to inform WHO of any findings that may impact product quality, safety, or effectiveness, or product availability. So for example, if an inspectional finding identifies a significant issue that would impact product quality or availability, we would need to inform the WHO. Because they are using this vaccine in global vaccination programs, and so it's important for them to know of these sorts of findings. And we can do this under confidentiality. That is, we are able to share confidential information with WHO to support the vaccine pre-qualification program. The other area where we provide support is in sharing of our review documents, inspection reports, and any other relevant documents that may facilitate WHO's assessment of the product dossier that they receive from the manufacturer for pre-qualification of a vaccine. I think you heard Deos mention this during his presentation also. And how this helps is that it allows WHO to streamline their dossier review by relying in large part on FDA's reviews for their assessment. And if WHO has any questions during their dossier review, they can reach out, we can discuss it. But really the main benefit is that it significantly decreases the amount of time it takes for WHO to do their assessment for vaccine pre-qualification. So those are some areas and means through which we support the WHO vaccine pre-qualification program.
Thank you so much for that response. All right, so we'll try to go back to Margaret. I know we had some connection issues with the previous question we tried, but I'll repeat that question one more time. What application is used for a biological product in a specialized medical device, and how will these products be evaluated?
Well, I'm happy to be back. The short answer is it depends. There is a mechanism to request designation for jurisdictional purposes. It will depend on the primary mode of action of the product. So if you have a single product that's got both a biologic and a device, depending on which one of those is most responsible for the desired effect, that's the type of application that will be submitted. That said, we do collaborate with our fellow centers and include, if it's regulated as a therapeutic biologic, for instance, it would be in CDER, and we would include folks from the Center for Devices in that review. It's also important to remember that your reporting requirements for safety post-approval would also be affected by both sets of regulations. So certainly start with the therapeutic area review division to have that conversation early on. So thanks for that.
All right, thank you so much for that response. One more question for you, Margaret. What happens when the documents are not submitted in the required format?
They are immediately rejected. They don't even make it to the review division to look at. So it's critical that you have your technical ducks in a row before sending them in. Thanks for that question.
All right, and thank you for that answer. Now we'll go on to some questions that we have for John. First question, does FDA automatically prioritize an ANDA, or does it have to be requested?
Hey, Nora, thanks so much for that question. And it's a great question. Yes, the applicant has to request prioritization. However, there are specific instances where FDA will go ahead and prioritize an application, and those are when it's needed for public health. So in the terms of drug shortage and public health emergency, FDA will go ahead and initiate those prioritizations even if it is not requested. But it is always best to request prioritization when submitting any amendments or or your application as a whole. And the list of prioritization can be found in map 5240.3, so you can see what you need.
Great, thank you so much for that information. We have another question for you, John. How does an application go from tentative approval to final approval?
Thanks, Nora. So an application, when it's tentatively approved, it's technically approved for all of the aspects of the application except for the fact that it is blocked by patent or exclusivity. So once an applicant sees that they're 3 months away from that blocking patent or exclusivity expiring, or they believe that they're 3 months away from being able to gain final approval, they need to submit an amendment to their application that requests final approval. They also need to submit within that submission. They need to include anything that's changed or anything that's been updated in that submission. FDA will take that in. We will review any changes and make sure, from a scientific perspective, everything is still good to go with that application. And as long as there's no longer any patent or exclusivity that is blocking it, we will be able to provide final approval to.
All right, thank you so much for that response as well. Looks like that is all the time we have for questions. Thank you again to all our speakers and presenters for the informative sessions.